2007, the year of the PC killer, known on store shelves as Crysis. As far as hardware was concerned for the PC, it was a massive leap forward from 2006. Multi-core CPUs finally went mainstream, and GPUs with unified shaders became the new baseline for dynamic graphics processing. With that all said, let's now take a look at the PC ecosystem, the hardware landscape, shall we call it, for 2007. Kicking it off with processors. AMD released their flagship CPUs in later 2007, those being the Venom X4 lineup. These CPUs were the first native quad-core desktop consumer CPUs released, where all 4 physical cores were located on a single piece of silicon, unlike Intel's Core 2 quads, which were essentially 2 dual-core dies fused together. I think back then AMD used the word glued together. These Venom X4 chips utilized the refreshed AM2 socket, which got the name AM2+. As for mainstream gaming, AMD had that sector covered as well, with some dual-core CPUs, specifically their Athlon 64X2 range of CPUs, with popular models like the Athlon 64X2 5000+, 6000+, and 6400+, all being the black editions. AMD also offered more budget, low-powered dual cores with their BE efficiency line of products, which all only had a TDP of 45 watts. CPUs like the Athlon X2 BE2300, the BE2350, and the BE2400. These low-powered line of BE CPUs were a great budget option for those wanting to enter the multi-core CPU scene, but staying below that $100 price range. As for Intel, they too had quad-core CPUs as previously mentioned, which were in the form of their Core 2 quad line of processors, specifically models like the Core 2 Quad Q6600, Q6700, and the ultra high-end enthusiast models like the Core 2 Extreme QX6800 and QX6850. As for the mainstream, Intel had that covered as well with their Core 2 Duo line of processors, which originally launched back in 2006. Intel did still release new Core 2 Duo models though in 2007, specifically their E4000 series, featuring CPUs like the Core 2 Duo E4300 and E4400, which sat in the $110 to $130 price range. These E4000 Core 2 Duo processors offered 2MB of L2 cache and were also fantastic overclockers. As for the Core 2 Duo E6000 series, Intel gave that series of CPUs from 2006 a refresh, so to speak. And some of the popular models that came out in 2007 were models like the Core 2 Duo E6320, E6420, and specifically models like the Core 2 Duo E6540, E6550, E6750, and E6850, which all made a shift to a 1333 MHz frontside bus. Unfortunately, none of these CPUs, specifically these models just mentioned, were under $100 at the time. If you wanted to enter the multi-core CPU scene back then, specifically with Intel, and specifically under $100, Intel did have a line of CPUs for you, those being the Pentium dual cores. Now, do not get these confused with Intel's Pentium D line of CPUs from 2005 and 2006. The Pentium dual-core CPUs were true dual-core chips. Both processing cores sat on a single piece of silicon, unlike the Pentium Ds, which were 2 single-core Pentium 4 dies stitched together. Memorable models like the E2160 and E2140 cost below $90. The E2160 clocked at 1.8 GHz had a launch price of $84 back in 2007, where the E2140 was even cheaper. Yes, it had a lower base clock of 1.6 GHz, but it came with a launch price of just $74. Also note, these Pentium dual cores had a lot of room for overclocking, due to their somewhat relatively slow 800 MHz frontside bus. Many budget builders quickly realized they could buy something like an E2160, pair it with a decent P35 chipset motherboard, and easily crank up the frontside bus, pushing that E2160 from its stock 1.8 GHz to 3 GHz or higher on cheap air cooling. Now, another thing to keep in mind here, All these Intel processors, the Core 2 Quads, Core 2 Duos, Pentium dual-core CPUs and so on, were all based on Intel's 775 socket, which was starting to show its versatility with so many different CPU options back in 2007. As for the graphics card scene, even though AMD had acquired ATI back in 2006 for $5.4 billion, they deliberately kept the ATI brand. Supposedly, this was because ATI's name was just so recognizable and respected in the gaming community. But honestly, I think AMD was just broke after the acquisition and couldn't afford a complete rebranding campaign. Okay, I'm joking. But I wouldn't be surprised if that was honestly part of the reasoning. With that said, ATI actually released two series of GPUs in 2007, the HD 2000 and HD 3000 lines. The HD 3000 series only squeezed in at the very tail end of 2007, featuring just their two flagship models, that being the HD 3870 and HD 3850. The rest of that lineup didn't arrive until 2008. The real meat though for ATI in 2007, ATI/AMD, was their HD 2000 series. Released in the early to mid part of the year, these were ATI's very first DirectX 10 GPUs. At the absolute top end, they had the flagship Radeon HD 2900 XT and the slightly cut down HD 2900 Pro. They also had a bit of an odd model, which was offered as an entry-level enthusiast card. This must have been for the Porsche Boxster owners. Anyway, that was called the HD 2900 GT, which sort of dialed things back a bit to 240 stream processors from 320 and also dropped its clock speeds. Moving now down to the mainstream, ATI had the HD 2600 XT, which typically packed between 256 or 512 megabytes of GDDR3 or GDDR4 memory. Below that, they also had the HD 2600 Pro, which ran at lower clock speeds, but it was usually paired with VRAM, but that being the slower DDR2, and in some instances, if lucky, the GDDR3 edition. Finally, for the entry-level budget builders, the type of guys you'd find at a $2 hoe convention, ATI offered them models like the HD 2400 XT and the HD 2400 Pro. The XT model gave you a 700 MHz core clock, 40 stream processors, and 256 megabytes of GDDR3 on a narrow 64-bit bus. Now, the 2400 Pro was the absolute base model, clocked at just 525 MHz with DDR2 memory. These were extremely low-power GPUs. They were commonly found in low-profile designs and often just used passive heatsinks without a fan. You know, the type of GPUs you'd mainly find back then in probably a media PC. As for the green team, Nvidia had already blown everyone away in late 2006 with their massive 8800 GTX. Their main focus in 2007 was just taking their new 8 series of DirectX 10 GPUs into the mid and lower tier GPU price points. Quickly though, looking at the high end, they had the crazy expensive stuff like the 8800 Ultra and the 8800 GTS, but the real game changer came out at the very end of the year, that being the 8800 GT. That card completely flipped the market upside down because it was basically giving you top tier performance but at a mid-range price. Speaking of the mid-range, that's where the 8600 series lived. You had the beefier 8600 GTS if you had a little bit of extra cash, but the standard 8600 GT was the absolute go-to card for most mid-tier gamers that year. And finally, for the ultra-budget guys, the $2 convention guys, Nvidia offered the 8500 GT and the bare-bones 8400 GS. These were heavily cut down just to keep the price tag as low as possible. They barely drew any power, and you'd usually see them in low-profile shapes with passive heatsinks and no fans, and were mostly just used for basic office PCs or media centers. But many budget gamers did try and get by with these cards. Now, as far as these two GPUs are concerned for pimps on a budget, they basically had the exact same specs. They both typically came with either 256 megabytes or 512 megabytes of DDR2 VRAM, with an effective memory clock of 800 MHz. They both had a core base clock of around 450 MHz and both came with 16 stream processors. They also both had a TDP of 40 watts, and the only difference between the two was that the 8500 GT had a 128-bit memory bus, where the 8400 GS had a narrow 64-bit memory bus. But there was another version of the 8400 GS released in 2007. It had its stream processors cut in half to just 8, but Nvidia did boost its core and shader clocks to try compensate for gaming performance. However, it still didn't perform as well as the first revision. But the trade-off brought much better media playback features that the original lacked. Ultimately, choosing between them came down to whether you prioritized raw gaming power or a smooth home theater experience. As for the GPU market share, Nvidia basically had taken the lion's share of it back in 2007, especially with the launch of the Nvidia 8 series line of GPUs. ATI's market share, surprisingly for the HD 2000 series, was actually lower than the HD 3000 series. It seems like these HD 2000 GPUs were not well received in 2007, but again they were up against one of Nvidia's best line of GPUs ever released. You may have noticed I have been showing pricing of the GPUs, but here is a small dedicated breakdown, starting with ATI. Pricing for their HD 2000 series depended heavily on the specific model and VRAM. The high-end HD 2900 series ranged from around $170 for the GT model up to around $500 for the XT model, with the Pro model sitting between $250 and $350. For the mid-range HD 2600 Pro and XT, those cost between $90 to $160, while the entry-level HD 2400 series was the cheapest option at around $50 to $85. Now, taking a look at Nvidia's 8 series lineup, which varied significantly across models. Their flagship 8800s ranged from roughly $200 to as high as $900. The mid-range 8600s cost as low as $120, sometimes lower, to as high as around $220, and the entry-level 8500 GT sat between $80 and $100, and the cheapest option, being the 8400 GS, was priced usually between $40 and as high as $70 in some scenarios. As for the PC gaming scene in 2007, I will say it was one of the better years. Not as good as 2008, but not bad, especially with titles like Crysis, The Orange Box, Call of Duty 4, Modern Warfare, Bioshock, Stalker, Shadow of Chernobyl, The Witcher, Company of Heroes, Unreal Tournament 3, and Mass Effect for the PC. As for PC hardware in the gaming scene, you could see developers were definitely starting to take advantage of multi-core CPUs, and you could see this with some of the game's hardware requirements. Crysis, for example, recommended a Core 2 Joe at 2.2 GHz, or an AMD Athlon X2 4400 Plus. Other games like Call of Duty 4 2 recommended a dual-core CPU at 1.8 GHz. So you could clearly start to see that if you wanted to have a reasonable experience back then, you needed a dual-core CPU, or at least a CPU with more than one CPU thread. Talking about PC hardware requirements though, let's take a look at the budget gaming rig I put together for 2007. Starting with RAM, we went with two 512MB sticks of DDR2 running at 667 MHz in dual channel. This would have cost us anywhere from $40 to $60 for the more budget stuff back in 07. As for storage, we went with two combinations. If you wanted to isolate your operating system, you could have stuck that on something like a cheap 40GB SATA drive, say for Windows XP, which would have cost us around $30, but if you were looking out for those sales, 40GB drives could be found on sale for as low as $20. From there, we would have needed something, a bit of additional storage for a few games. So if you were really on a budget, you could have added something like an 80GB IDE drive for as low as $30. I mean, I wouldn't have advised it, I would have rather gone with a single 160GB SATA 2 drive, which would have cost you between $50 to $60. Moving on to our CPU, we went with the cheapest dual core available for back in 07, and that was the Intel Pentium dual core, specifically the E2140. This CPU was clocked at 1.6 GHz across both cores and had a frontside bus of 800 MHz. It also came with 1 MB of L2 cache and had a TDP of just 65 watts. This CPU would have cost us around $74 back then and would have needed the Intel 775 socket motherboard. That's why we decided to go with the ever impressive Gigabyte GA945 GC-MX-S2 motherboard, which would have cost us around $50 to $60. An impressive motherboard for its price, as it came with 7.1 surround sound, gigabit Ethernet, and supported PCIe graphics cards. It also had 2 RAM slots, 4 SATA ports, along with an IDE and a floppy port. It also came with 2 PCI slots and a PCIe X1 slot. Not the best overclocking motherboard due to its 945 chipset, but offered a lot more than most budget boards at the price. For the GPU, I decided to go with the XFX Nvidia 8400GS 512MB pimp on a budget graphics card. This is the revision 2 model, which only has 8 stream processors, but it does come out of the box with higher clocks and better media playback. So it was definitely the better all-rounder of a GPU, and this would have cost us between $50 to $60. Now please don't be ignorant.
No, they're ignorant. That's ignorant.
We needed a DVD-ROM as well, which would have cost us $15 to $20, and we can't forget about a case and a PSU. Now, back then you could get really cheap case and PSU combinations. I mean, really cheap. A Lynx World case, $20 guys, and it came with a 430 watt dodgy as hell PSU, but it got the job done. You could also pick up like a JPAC case with a 500 watt PSU. Heck, it even came with some blue LED 80mm fan. So yeah, not a bad option on a budget. Enough talk. Let's now move on to the benchmarks to see what this budget rig could do. Looking at Cinebench R10 with the 2007 budget build. For CPU single core score, we got 1589. For multi-core, we got 2983. And for OpenGL, we got 2099. Looking at Cinebench R11.5 for the 2007 build. For the single core CPU score, we got 0.45. And for the multi-core, we got 0.85. Looking at 3D Mark 05, for the CPU score, we came in with 6873. This is for the 2007 budget build. And for the game score, we came in with 3184. Moving on to gaming now, looking at GTA San Andreas from 2005 at 1280 by 1024 with a high preset, no anti-aliasing. We got an average of 59 frames per second with a max of 70 and a minimum of 50. Looking at Fear now at 1280 by 960 with a mix of medium and minimum settings. We got an average frame rate of 45, a max of 62 and a minimum of 23 for the 2007 budget build. Now for Oblivion at 720p with the low preset, no anti-aliasing and no grass. For the 2007 build, we got an average of 37, a max of 53 and a minimum of 17 frames per second. For the inevitable Crysis at 1024x768 with the low preset and no anti-aliasing for the 2007 budget build, we got an average frame rate of 21, a max of 27, and a minimum of 13. For Stalker at 1024x768 with the low preset, no anti-aliasing and static lighting. For the 07 build, we came in with an average of 78, a maximum of 104, and a minimum of 57. Time now for Far Cry 2 at 720p with the low preset, no anti-aliasing. For the 07 budget build, we got an average frame rate of 24, a max of 44, and a minimum of 17. Moving on to Dead Space at 720p, low preset, no anti-aliasing. For the 07 budget build, we got an average frame rate of 38, a max of 67, and a minimum of 24. Looking at Operation Flashpoint Dragon Rising, this was a bit of a hard one. At 720p, low preset, no anti-aliasing. For the 07 budget build, we got an average of 8, a max of 10, and a minimum of 6. As for Dragon Age Origins at 720p with the low preset, no anti-aliasing, the 07 budget build managed an average frame rate of 18, a max of 33, and a minimum of 11. Looking at Metro 2033, for the 07 budget build, we got an average of 9, a max of 18, and a minimum of 5, struggling here as we can see. This build turned out better than expected. The Pentium dual core was surprisingly capable, and with a mild overclock where I pushed the E2140 just past 2 GHz while keeping the RAM at around 667, it was stable enough, but the 945 chipset definitely held back the GPU overclocking, where I couldn't overclock both the CPU and GPU at the same time without the system becoming unstable. I had to pick one, even though. So anyway, even at stock speeds, this rig outlasted the 2006 build, and the socket 775 offered plenty of upgrade paths. The real highlight of 2007 was affordability. Dual-core CPUs under $100, and budget GPUs that could actually game. Pairing this with a 8600 GT or even a HD 2600 XT could have stretched it, I believe, into 2009, although I believe the CPU would eventually become the bottleneck. Anyway, 2007 was the turning point. Exciting hardware, big leaps in each release of hardware, and it was a great year for budget builders. Anyway, look out for our next 2008 video. If you haven't seen the 2006 video, I suggest you go and watch that. And if you like the video, please consider subscribing, hit that like button so you don't miss out on the next line of great content.